The best old-time radio from people you trust. The Radio Nostalgia Network, where the oldies are still young.
In the dream, you are falling, lost in the listening distance, as dark locks in.
No one ever thought that May Forster would marry John Charrington, but he thought differently, and things which John Charrington intended had a queer way of coming to pass. He asked her to marry him before he went up to Oxford. She laughed and refused him. He asked her again next time he came home. Again she laughed, tossed her dainty blonde head, and again refused. The third time he asked her, she said it was becoming a confirmed bad habit, and laughed at him more than ever. John was not the only man who wanted to marry her. She was the belle of our village coterie, and we were all in love with her, more or less. It was a sort of fashion, like masher collars or Inverness capes. Therefore, we were as much annoyed as surprised when John Charrington walked into our little local club — we held it in a loft over the Saddlers, I remember — and invited us all to his wedding. Your wedding? John Charrington filled his pipe and lighted it before he replied. Then he said, "I'm sorry to deprive you fellows of your only joke, but Miss Forster and I are to be married in September." "You don't mean it? He's been jilted again and has turned his head." "No," I said, rising. "I see it's true. Lend me a pistol, someone, or a first-class fare to the other end of nowhere. Charrington has bewitched the only pretty girl in our 20-mile radius. Was it mesmerism or love potion, Jack?" "Neither, sir, but a gift you'll never have, perseverance, and the best luck a man ever had in this world." There was something in his voice that silenced me, and all the chaff of the other fellows failed to draw him further. The queer thing about it was that when we congratulated Miss Forster, she blushed and smiled and dimpled, for all the world as though she were in love with him and had been in love with him all the time. Upon my word, I think she had. Women are strange creatures. We were all asked to the wedding, and I was to be best man. Does she care for him? I used to ask myself in the early days of their engagement, but after a certain evening in August, I never asked it again. I was coming home from the club through the churchyard. Our church is on a time-grown hill, and the turf about it is so thick and soft that one's footsteps are noiseless. I made no sound as I vaulted the low lichened wall and threaded my way between the tombstones. It was at the same instant that I heard John Charrington's voice and saw her. May was sitting on a low, flat gravestone, with the full splendour of the western sun upon her mignon face. Its expression ended at once and for ever any question of love for him. It was transfigured to a beauty I should not have believed possible, even to that beautiful face. John lay at her feet, and it was his voice that broke the stillness of the golden August evening. "My dear, I believe I should come back from the dead if you wanted me." I coughed at once to indicate my presence, and passed on into the shadow, fully enlightened. The wedding was to be early in September. 2 days before, I had to run up to town on business. The train was late, of course. We are on the South Eastern, and as I stood grumbling with my watch in my hand, whom should I see but John Charrington and May Forster? They were walking up and down the unfrequented end of the platform, arm in arm, looking into each other's eyes, careless of the sympathetic interest of the porters. When the train eventually drew up at the platform, I passed the pair as I made my way to the first-class smoking carriage. "Hello, old man." John's voice was cheery as he swung his bag into my carriage. "Here's luck. I was expecting a dull journey." He shut the door and leaned out for a last word with his sweetheart. "Oh, I wish you wouldn't go, John," she was saying, with a pleading intensity which would have sent my Gladstone onto the platform and me after it. But she wasn't speaking to me. John Charrington was made differently. He rarely changed his opinions, never his resolutions. "I must, May. Old Branbridge has been awfully good to me," he answered. and we steamed out. After he had seen the last of the little figure on the platform, he leaned back in his corner and kept silence for a minute. When he spoke, it was to explain to me that he was both Mr. Brambridge's godson and sole heir. The old man lay dying, and had sent for him, and he had felt bound to go. "I shall be surely back tomorrow," he said, "or if not, the day after, in heaps of time." "And suppose Mr. Brambridge dies?" "Alive or dead, I mean to be married on Thursday," John answered, lighting a cigar and unfolding the Times. John alighted at Peasmarsh Junction, while I went on to London, where I stayed the night. When I got home the next afternoon, a very wet one by the way, my sister greeted me with, "Where's Mr. Charrington?" "Isn't he back?" I answered testily, for I had confidently expected to find him at home. "No, Geoffrey, he has not returned, and what is more, you may depend upon it, he won't." "There'll be more wedding tomorrow than ever you'll take the first part in," I retorted, a prophecy which, by the way, came true. But though I could snarl confidently to my sister, I did not feel so comfortable when, late that night, standing on the doorstep of John's house, I heard he had not returned. I went home gloomily through the rain. Next morning brought a brilliant blue sky, gold sun, and all such softness of air and beauty of cloud as go to make up a perfect day. With my shaving water came a note from John. Mr. Brambridge had begged him so to stay another night that he had not the heart to refuse. I was to meet him at the station at 3 and come straight on to the church. I was at the station at 2:30. I felt rather annoyed with John. It seemed a sort of slight to the beautiful girl who loved him, that he should come, as it were, out of breath and with the dust of travel upon him, to take her hand, which some of us would have given the best years of our lives to take. But when the 3 o'clock train glided in and glided out again, having brought no passengers to our little station, I was more than annoyed. There was no other train for 35 minutes. The 3:35 was late, of course. I ground my pipe between my teeth and stamped with impatience as I watched the signals. Click. The signal went down. 5 minutes later, I flung myself into the carriage that I had brought for John. "Drive to the church," I said. "Mr. Charrington hasn't come." Anxiety now replaced anger. What had become of the man? Could he have been taken suddenly ill? I had never known him have a day's illness in his life, and even so he might have telegraphed. Some awful accident must have happened to him. The thought that he had played her false never, no, not for a moment, entered my head. Something terrible had happened to him, and on me lay the task of telling his bride. It was 5 minutes to 4 as we drew up at the churchyard gate. A double row of eager onlookers lined the path from Lichgate to porch. I sprang from the carriage and passed up between them. Our gardener had a good front place near the door. I stopped. "Are they waiting still, Byles?" I asked, simply to gain time, for of course I knew they were by the waiting crowd's attentive attitude. "Waiting, sir? No, sir." "Why? Must be over by now." "Over? Then Mr. Charrington's come?" "To the minute, sir. Must have missed you somehow. And I say, sir," lowering his voice, "I never see Mr. John the least bit so afore. But my opinion is, he's been drinking pretty free. His clothes was all dusty, and his face like a sheet. I tell you, I didn't like the looks of him at all, and the folks inside are saying all sorts of things. You'll see. Something's gone very wrong with Mr. John, and he's tried liquor. He looked like a ghost, and in he went with his eyes straight before him, with never a look or a word for none of us. Him, there was always such a gentleman." As the bride and bridegroom came out, I saw that Byles was right. John Charrington did not look himself. There was dust on his coat, his hair was disarranged. He seemed to have been in some row, for there was a black mark above his eyebrow. He was deathly pale, but his pallor was not greater than that of the bride, who might have been carved in ivory. Dress veil, orange blossoms, face, and all. As they passed out, the ringers stooped. There were 6 of them. And then, on the ears expecting the gay wedding peal, came the slow tolling of the passing bell. A thrill of horror at so foolish a jest from the ringers passed through us all. But the ringers themselves dropped the ropes and fled like rabbits out into the sunlight. The bride shuddered, and grey shadows came about her mouth, but the bridegroom led her on down the path where the people stood with the handfuls of rice. But the handfuls were never thrown, and the wedding bells never rang. In a hush, like the hush in the chamber of death, the bridal pair passed into their carriage, and its door slammed behind them. Then the tongues were loosed, a babel of anger, wonder, conjecture from the guests and the spectators. "If I had seen his condition, sir," said old Forster to me as we drove off, "I would have stretched him on the floor of the church, sir, by heaven I would, before I'd have let him marry my daughter." He put his head out of the window. "Drive like hell," he cried to the coachman. "Don't spare the horses." He was obeyed. We passed the bride's carriage. I forbore to look at it, and old Forster turned his head away and swore. We reached home before it. We stood in the doorway in the blazing afternoon sun, and in about half a minute we heard wheels crunching the gravel. When the carriage stopped in front of the steps, old Forster and I ran down. I had the door open in a minute, and this is what I saw. No sign of John Charrington, and of May, his wife. Only a huddled heap of white satin lying half on the floor of the carriage and half on the seat. "I drove straight here, sir," said the coachman, as the bride's father lifted her out, "and I'll swear no one got out of the carriage." We carried her into the house in her bridal dress and drew back her veil. I saw her face. Shall I ever forget it? White and drawn with agony and horror, bearing such a look of terror as I have never seen since, except in dreams. And her hair, her radiant, blonde hair, I tell you, was white like snow. As we stood, her father and I, half mad with the horror and mystery of it, a boy came up the avenue, a telegraph boy. They brought the orange envelope to me. I tore it open. Mr. Charrington was thrown from the dog-cart on his way to the station at 1:30, killed on the spot. And he was married to May Forster in our parish church at 3:30, in presence of half the parish. I shall be married, dead or alive. What had passed in that carriage on the homeward drive? No one knows. No one will ever know. Oh, May, my dear. Before a week was over, they laid her beside her husband in our little churchyard on the thyme-covered hill, the churchyard where they had kept their love trysts. Thus was accomplished John Charrington's wedding.
John Charrington's Wedding by E. Nesbitt was abridged for radio by Roy Apps and read by Tobias Menzies. It was produced by Celia de Wolfe and was a peer production for BBC Radio 4 Extra.